Welcome to this session, Things You Won't Learn in a Typical Excel Class. This is Sharon Fry. Thanks for joining me. Here's our first tip of the session. How do you enter a value or formula in multiple cells at once? In this situation, we have a little payroll sheet, very basic, very simple, and we have entered the hours from time cards for the people that use time cards, and now everyone else that has no hours entered yet should have a value of 40 hours entered. So we're going to click on the first cell for Andrew's hours. Then I'm holding my control key while I click on all of the other blank cells in the hours column. By the way, in the latest version of Excel, you may notice that as you hold control, it used to be if you accidentally selected something that you didn't want to select, you'd have to start all over again. But now I can continue holding control and click that mistaken selection and deselect it. So now I have the 4 cells selected in which I want all of them to say 40 hours. I'll type 40, which as you can see is showing up here in the last selected cell. And now I'm going to hold my control key while I press enter. And the entry that I typed in the last selected cell has now been entered in all 4 of those cells. So that's our first tip. We're going to have some more very shortly. But first, let's just talk a little bit about this session. Just to give you an overview, this is a collection of some of the favorites of mine and people that I've shared with as far as tips and tricks and best practices. So it may seem somewhat random when presented all together this way. It will be almost all demo, and that's because the best way to share these things is to show and tell. So that's the main mode for this session. I do my best to narrate every action, so there may even be bonus tips for you in how I typically do things. It will go quickly, but remember this is recorded and there are ways to get access to it after the summit. The All Access Pass will include my companion ebook that will contain all of the information presented. And I am in the chat to answer questions, and I hope to get some new tips there from you too. Now a little bit about me, only to answer the question, who is Sharon Fry and how does she know what she's talking about for this session? Excel is my favorite core office application. Good thing since I spend so much time with it. Training delivery options include one-on-one at your desk to hundreds online and everything in between. Improving productivity can be life-changing, so helping people do it makes me happy, and I'm passionate about continuous learning. These are the relevant certifications, and there are more. I was first certified in Excel and Word 97 in 2000, and I've just celebrated 10 years of MCT-hood in June 2019. And please feel free to contact me and be sure to mention this summit if you do. Now let's get back to the demo. Typically, I prefer not to hide rows and columns, generally because you forget they're hidden and then you end up having them in your way or not realizing something's happening because it's in a hidden row or column. So some other ways that I have come up with that you can hide information is, for example, if we look at this cell E3, there's actually text in it, and all I have done is made the font for it white. So now if I make it the theme color to match what's in A3, we see the text there now. The next thing we're going to do is calculate the amount of pay for each employee. So I want to tell you another tip of mine that sounds like a very tiny thing, but it saves me a lot of time. For our amount for our first employee, Nancy, obviously for every employee it's going to be the amount of hours times the rate. This is not a very complex formula, but we'll go ahead into the cell for the amount for our first employee. We'll start, of course, with our equal sign and then click on our number of hours for Nancy, type our asterisk for multiplying, and then click on Nancy's rate. Now here's the trick. When I finish a formula or any other kind of entry in a cell, I don't want to move to another cell. If I hit tab, of course, I would go to the right. If I hit enter, then I'm going to move down. I don't want to move. I want to stay on this cell. So I'm going to hold control while I press enter. And now I have completed the formula. Notice my status bar down at the bottom says ready. I'm no longer in edit mode. I can't see the formula anymore, looking at the cell, and I have completed the entry without moving. The next thing is we need to use this formula again for the rest of the employees. So our next tip is fill cells in a column without dragging the autofill handle. Now you probably know that if you click and drag this bottom right corner, that's going to do something called autofill. However, when you have a set of data that has 50, 100, hundreds, thousands of rows, that can be a pretty long drag. So when your data is arranged in an obvious manner so that Excel can tell how far the data should go down, all you need to do is double click on that autofill handle. Now we have a little problem here. It autofilled all the way down into our total cell because that was connected to our data set. So I am going to undo that, and for undo, of course, I'm using Control Z, which if you hover over any of those buttons that you use frequently, you will see in parentheses what those keyboard shortcuts are. Those are the ones I learned first, are the ones I'm hitting all day long. So we've undone our autofill, and what I'm also going to mention to you is that I found it to be a best practice, especially as Excel has increased its ability for auto-detecting ranges, to keep blank rows and columns around my sets of data. So I would consider this a set of data. The total is not part of the data. So what I would do here is actually insert a blank row above my total. So I'm selecting the row that has total, right-clicking, and choosing insert. Now if you don't like to see all of that space between the data and the total, you can certainly take care of that. But before I do, I want to point out, once you've inserted rows or columns, you will see this pop-up button called Insert Options. And in this case, it's telling me that I can format whatever rows I've inserted, the same as the ones above, the same as the ones below, or clear any formatting from that row, which I'll do. And then I'm going to adjust the height of that row so it's almost not even there. We have almost the same appearance. Technically, I could even hide that row, but I, again, like to at least see that it's there. I could even go down as far as 1.5, still a gap. And what that gap does for me, and then later on, you'll see that that happens with any data set, is that now if I select any cell within my set of data, and I use the Control A shortcut, it can auto-detect my entire range of data. Now that's great for me, but that also means I can see if, for example, I wanted to sort or turn on auto filter, what data Excel would already know to include. Now, if I use the Control A shortcut a second time, it will extend my selection to the entire worksheet. Now, if I'm not in a data set when I use Control A, it will automatically just select the entire worksheet. And that is the same as clicking that little triangle that's right above row 1 and just to the left of column A in that little corner. Same thing. So now if we go back to our formula in our first amount for our first employee, double click the autofill handle, it knows to stop at the end of our list of employees. So that's another advantage of keeping that gap row between our data and any other information or summarizing. This is not a very complex formula. If I double click, we see it simply equals D9 times E9. But let's say you've worked really hard and it's been a struggle to get a formula to be exactly the way you need it to be. You don't want to lose that formula. So what I do is I make myself a little backup by copying the guts of the formula. You can't copy the cell for this. You actually need the contents of the cell. And I will right click and copy that. And then I'll press escape so that I can exit this cell's edit mode without breaking anything. Escape. And then I'm going to go to the label of the column, in this case amount, in cell F8. And I'm going to right click and insert what is now called a note. You might be familiar with the comment feature that has been in Excel for quite some time. In 2019 in Office 365, it has now shifted, and those traditional comments in Excel are now called notes. The comments, you can do one or the other. The comments are now more like what you might find in Word or PowerPoint, more for collaboration and review with other people. So we're going to create a new note, and then I'll show you what a new comment would look like. So when we do a new note, I get a text box, I get a red triangle in the top right corner, and then I will simply paste the formula. So now I've sort of got it stored in a little backup place. And then when I'm not moused over that cell, after I click on another cell, I won't ever see it. It doesn't have to print. It's just there for my safekeeping. If you wanted to do a comment, when you right click, you can choose new comment. And now you will see that you have the ability to @mention people or comment simply to say, please review this data, and then I'll send that. Notice then someone can reply. I see the name of the cell that has this comment. I can edit my own comments, and then you can delete a thread or resolve a thread. So if someone else comes along and says, it looks good, and they send that, then we can say, all right, let's resolve this. You can find both the notes and the comments in the Review tab of the ribbon. The first group here is the comments. That's the purple call out in the corner now. The next group here is for the notes. Most often, I prefer to right click and use the menu here, but you'll notice you also have the ability to only delete comments, and you'll have to go to the ribbon for the others. So definitely take a look at the new setup for comments and notes. Let's go ahead and finish this formula here. If you're not familiar and you find yourself going up to the Formulas tab or going through the function library or clicking the FX button simply because you need to insert a function here, remember that you can start typing your equals for a formula and then just start typing the name of the function that you want to use. And I will get all the way to the sum and hit tab to finish it. Then I can simply select the range of cells that I want to have summed, close my parentheses, and Control Enter. Now, of course, sum is one of those so frequently used functions, in fact, probably the most frequently used function, that of course it has its own button. That also has a keyboard shortcut of Alt equals. And what that will do for you is actually shortcut the whole process, including guessing at what you want summed. So if I hold my Alt key while I type in equals, it has filled in the equals, the sum, the parentheses, and even guessed at which cells that I want to be summed. Now technically we could leave it through F18, but the reality is it should only be F9 through F17. So all I need to do is reselect the cells that I want, and then I can do my Control Enter again. So now we have our total. I'm also going to hit save, which in the future I will see has Control S, and that will update my file. The next thing we're going to do is, now that we've got this week's payroll done for week ending 12/15, we want to make a copy of this sheet and then ultimately prepare it for next week's payroll. Now, you may already be familiar with right-clicking, move or copy, going through that whole dialog box, but here's the easy way to create a completely duplicated copy of a worksheet. We're going to start by clicking and dragging on the Sheet tab until that little black triangle at the top of the tab moves from the left side to the right side. And as I'm doing so, you'll notice my little mouse pointer has a piece of paper attached to it. If I hold my Control key, you'll see a little plus sign shows up in there. And of course my circles that indicate my Control key being pressed. So when I control my movement and let go of the mouse button first, I will get a copy of that sheet. And we're going to rename this with my recommended naming conventions. Try to keep your tab names short and sweet. I prefer not to use spaces. I generally don't even use dashes, but for visibility in this case I will, and then press enter. And if you missed that, well, guess what? I cannot undo it. Sheet actions are not in your undo stack. So you'll notice the last thing in my undo list is my formula that I entered in F19. But if you missed it, the easy way to get into rename mode is simply to double click on the tab name. Most of your actions, if not all of your sheet actions, are not undoable, so keep that in mind. And then we'll go back to the first tips sheet because I have one more. We talked about notes to back up formulas. We talked about duplicating an entire worksheet in one move and manage bulk text with less aggravation. So you may have been wondering, how is this nice little bulleted list of tips working? It's not text in a cell. If I click in this cell out to the right and press my arrow keys, you'll notice there's cells behind that text. So here's the trick. This is actually a text box. You'll notice when I select it, up in my ribbon, I have the Shape Format tab, and this gives me greater control over what I call bulk text. So I'm going to scroll down here to a comparison. Some of you might be familiar with using Merge and Center. So on the left, I've got the same text box, except I've added a title, and we'll talk about that in a moment. To the right, I've replicated that same text in a merged and centered cell, and then aligned it left instead of centered. So you will notice that I can still do individual formatting within the text. I've got some bold, I've got some italic. The bullets are not built into Excel. Those I simply typed with a symbol. And I have merge and center, and of course wrap text. And I will say that Excel has gotten better at allowing you to edit and format text within a cell. So if I expand my formula bar here, you will see that all of that text is in there. You don't see the formatting in the formula bar though. If you need to do multiple lines, the way to add another line break is holding Alt and pressing Enter. But I'll backspace that. But if I do, and I pressed enter by accident, if I do want to format text, if I select a word, you'll see I do get a little mini toolbar. I can make it bigger, and then I will see it happening in the cell. I will hit escape though, and that will cancel my changes. So there's some formatting you can do in there. But what you will notice is that the spacing is actually greater between the lines than it is in my text box. You also don't have all the formatting options that you would have in a text box. So for example, if I want this title to be a little bigger, that would happen. I could format it with a different color. You could do that in the merged and centered cells as well. But I'm going to center this and make it bold so we can see it better. That you cannot do in the cell. You have to have the cell be all one alignment. Now here's another thing. You cannot do inside a cell any of the word art styles. So if I wanted to make this title even fancier, We can do that too, but you cannot do that inside a merged and centered cell. The other thing is that you have shape options. So the way I inserted this text box is simply going up to the Insert tab, and either over on the far right in the text group, there's a button right there for text box, but it's technically just a shape from the shape menu. It'll be the first shape under basic shapes, and then you simply drag and draw it. Once you've drawn it, you can see the shape format tab in the ribbon. Now, once you've got the shape, as long as you are selected on the shape itself, then you can format everything in the shape. Otherwise, if you see a flashing insertion point, you can edit the text inside the shape. So the dotted border, when you're in text edit mode, select that dotted border, and now you've got the whole shape selected, which means I can also go up to, let's say, the edit shape and change the shape. Maybe I'd like some other kind of shape. Now, doesn't look like it changed my shape because I have a white fill with a no border, so no outline. But if I go ahead and start changing my outline, you'll see that outline. And then of course I can change the fill. I can fill it with a picture or a gradient or even a texture. Same textures we've had for at least 20 years, at least since Office 97 actually. My favorite is the dead fish. We also have the ability to modify the shape with the, what I call the, let me put some color on there, the aspect changers. But I'll go back to my undo list and put that back to before I changed shape. So there's many more formatting options. You also have complete control over the positioning, whereas when you've got merged and centered cells or merged and centered and left aligned cells, you are constrained to positioning these with the rows and columns. Now, one advantage that you also have with the merged and centered and left aligned cells is that a screen reader can read the text in the cells, whereas text in text boxes may not be readable by screen readers. But this is what I use for any kind of notes on a spreadsheet at the bottom. Let's say you want a comment section, anything that requires more than just what you would normally put in a cell. I just make a text box. If I want it to show, I can format it. If I don't want it to show, then I make it white fill and no border. Let's move on to our other worksheet and prepare it for next week's payroll entries. So the first thing I'm going to do is change the title. Now, this text was a little tricky. I put some text in E3 and then the other text in A3. I'm going to get rid of this text in E3 and I'm going to just call this next week's payroll. Now, what if I want this centered in this space? You might think, well, Sharon, that's when you use merge and center. But merge and center can cause all kinds of problems. It's not too bad in the title areas, but definitely not in your data because it does then restrict sorting, filtering. It's hard to copy and paste when you have merged cells. And that is also an area where it would cause conflict or confusion to a screen reader. So what I do instead is something that I'm hoping Microsoft will soon make more of a prominent option. And just to remind you, here's what merge and center would look like. So it looks like the entire cell, and it is one cell. But I'm going to undo that by turning it off, and then I'm going to go into the alignment dialog box. So what we're going to see here is under the horizontal alignment where it's currently general, we're going to go all the way down to this option called Center Across Selection. And then we'll simply click OK. The appearance will be exactly like merge and center. The behavior of, let's say I make a column much wider, it will still remain centered in that space, but every cell is still a separate cell. I will undo my column resizing. So again, the text lives in A3 if I need to change it. It's not in C or D, and we used alignment, horizontal, center, not center alone, but center across selection. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to get rid of this text box. Now what I did here, another way to hide things or make them look different or invisible, I should say, These cells were already white filled. Really, they're not white, they're none. If we go up to the fill bucket, we see they're set to no fill. But the grid lines have been hidden by doing this. I simply went to the borders button, all the way down to the bottom to more borders, and I made the color of the borders white. Now in this case, what I'm going to do to change that back is choose none for the style, which then doesn't matter what color is chosen, and do the outline and the inside and click OK. And now we have our grid lines back. And then we don't need this big row 4 anymore. I'm going to right click and delete it. Before we can enter the next week's data, first of all, we'll change the date, and you can do 12/22. You don't need the year, it will assume the current year. Then we need to make sure we clear out any data. So I'm going to select all the hours and simply press delete. Now the delete key is not deleting anything, remember? It's simply a shortcut for the command of clear contents. So that's all it's doing. Now let's say that this week we're going to have a new employee. So we're going to select the last employee. Now you might say, well, Sharon, if we had the formulas already including that blank row, we could just insert a new row. But then you have to format, you have to check for any formulas and bring those down. Here's what I do. As long as you're inserting between the endpoints, let's say of this formula, as long as I insert something between F8 and F16, it will be included and adjust this formula accordingly. So my best practice here is I will copy the last row and then right click on it again and choose Insert Copied Cells. And then here is where I could simply select everything in this row and go up to Find and Select from my Home tab in the Editing group and find all the constants. So find in Excel, or go to, I should say, is selecting. So once those are selected, I simply hit delete, and now I'm ready for the next employee. So if I type in 10, and in this case I'll just say it's me, $20 an hour, and now we're ready for the next week's hours to be entered. Now we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about working with bigger data. So I have a sheet here called, surprise, surprise, bigger data, that I've labeled working with bigger data. And let's say I've been provided with some data, maybe exported out of another system or copied and pasted from some very messy worksheet, and I want to reformat it and clean it up. So I'm going to just go through the steps that I would normally go through and describe everything I'm doing along the way, and hopefully you'll be able to pick up some tips and tricks that I can show you. So the first thing is this data has no formatting, no column widths, nothing. It's just been brought in what I call plain or raw text. First thing I want to do is of course freeze panes so that when I'm scrolling down through the data, I can see what those first rows labels are, the first rows of the data, and of course everything above that. So when we go to the View tab, and probably something you all already know, but just to be clear, you'll see under the Window group, or in the Window group, there's a button called Freeze Panes. There are 3 options, none of which can be combined together. So if I freeze the first column, now I can only scroll horizontally and keep column A visible. If I freeze the top row, now it's simply row 1, which is not sufficient for our needs. So the third option says, or the first option I should say, now says unfreeze panes, which we will do. And then it says freeze panes to keep rows and columns visible based on current selection. So what that means is the cell that I am selecting before I choose freeze panes is, you can think of it as your first moving cell, or everything above it and everything to the left of it is what's going to remain visible. So I'm going to select C6 so that row 5 and above and columns A and B will remain visible. And then we'll go to freeze panes and I will simply freeze panes. Now when I scroll down, I can still see rows 1 through 5, and when I scroll across, columns A and B. The next thing I want to do is I want to format this header row. So I'm going to click on A5 where we can see it says product ID. And to quickly get to the far end of this row and the data within it, I'm going to hold my Control and my Shift together, generally with my left pinky and ring finger, and then I'm going to press my right arrow key on my keyboard. Now what that actually did was jump because of Control and select because of Shift. So to be clear, when I, for example, select one cell and use my arrow keys, it moves one cell at a time. Now if I hold Control when I press my arrow key, it jumps from data to data. In other words, any blank cells will be jumped over. And when I hold Shift while I'm using my arrow keys, I'm extending or retracting my selected area. So that's why clicking on the first cell, press and hold Control and Shift together, and right arrow will then jump to the other end of my header row. And I'm actually going to go up to the Home tab and go over to the cell styles. And if you haven't used these, they can be very handy. They can also be created of your own new cell style down below, but we're just going to use my plain old heading 3. So that's done. Whenever I receive data like this where I cannot tell if there is any sort of sequence, so they're not in product ID order, they're not alphabetical by product name, etc. Those no apparent sequence. I might need to get back to this original sort. What I usually do is I will create another column, and in this case I will put this other column on the right side at the end of the data. And what I generally do is I will just give it a name called orig sort. And this is just a reference column for me. I will Control Enter to stay on that cell. Then I will also select the cell to the left of it, click my Format Painter once up in the ribbon in the Home tab in the Clipboard group, and then copy and paste that formatting essentially onto my new column header. The next thing I'm going to do is select the first row, and here's another tip. I will usually click on the header and press my down arrow once just to make sure I'm not accidentally scrolled down halfway down the list and then I'm not starting at the top. So I've made the habit of clicking on the column label, pressing my down arrow once. Now I know I'm in the first row of the data. And what I'm going to do is type a 1. And my autofill handle, remember we've used autofill earlier for copying and pasting a formula, this is going to let me autofill a series. Now remember, you can also use the autofill handle by double clicking it when you have a designated data area. So I'll do that. But it did not come up with the sequential numbers. So down at the bottom, there's this little button at the end of my visible area of autofill, and it says autofill options. When I click that, I fill series, and that will change it to the sequential numbers. Now in this case, you may already know that you can also hold Control while you pull the autofill handle. I can never remember which one it is, and I get a lot of use out of this autofill options. Be careful to click the right button. You don't want the quick analysis button. That's an entirely different thing. So make sure when you hover over the button, it's the one that says autofill options. So now I have a way to get the data back in the original order in which I received it by sorting by that column. The next thing I'm going to do is autofit these columns. It's annoying that I cannot see all of the values in the columns. So I will click somewhere in the data, and you may already know that, let's say for product name, or let's say supplier, and not interfere with the frozen panes, if I go up between the column headings, the C and the D buttons themselves, and put my mouse over that divider line and double click, it will auto fit column C to be as wide as it needs based on the contents of all of its cells. And I could do the same thing for every single column. I could also select multiple columns. In fact, I could select all of these columns, double click between any two of the selected columns, and every column would auto fit to its own needs, except for one little problem. Because of our sheet title, Working with Bigger Data, column A got really large and we didn't need it to be so large. So instead, when I want my column widths to be based only on the data in my list, I will select somewhere in the list, use my Control A to select all of the data, and confirm that all of the data is selected by holding my Control and scrolling my mouse wheel to do a quick zoom out, and then I can zoom back in. And I've actually zoomed in here to 150% for you folks to see better. And I'll click the zoom button in the bottom right corner because it went from 145 to 160. I'll type in 150 and press enter. Now that all my data is selected, I can't double click between any two columns because that's going to use the whole column as a reference. So I go to my Home tab of the ribbon all the way over to the Cells group, to the Format button, and this is where all of those options for row height and column width are. So auto fit row height, column width, row height to put them in by the numbers, and then the auto fits, and then what the default width is for any column, and I want auto fit column width. So since I have cells selected, it will only base the column width on the selected cells. And if I then decide I want certain cells to be the same width or certain columns to be the same width, let's say we have these columns with numbers in them, but they've got really long column labels. The first thing I need to do is select them all again. Oh, let me click on Product ID, Control Shift, right arrow. And up in my ribbon in the Home tab in the Alignment group, I'm going to click Wrap Text. That will make it so any column that is too narrow to display the entire name of a column will then wrap the text inside those cells. So then I'm going to take my units in stock, units on order, and reorder level. Those essentially all refer to the same type of value, a quantity of product. And then with 3 columns selected, the right side of any of these columns, I can click and drag, and that will make all 3 columns the same exact width as each other. Now it didn't automatically resize row 5. So between row 5 and 6 on the left hand side, I will do the same thing I did to auto fit a column width, but now I'm auto fitting a row height by double clicking between the 5 and the 6. Now that might be a little overkill, so we'll go ahead and expand or select those 3 columns and re-expand them so all 3 labels are on 2 lines, and then we'll again auto fit the row height. So there we go. Now you might like to center these column labels, and that's certainly fine. I prefer to keep them left aligned because when you turn on filtering, and I think Helen is covering filtering in another session, but then the filter button will not be obscuring so much of the header label. Next thing I would do, I need this product ID to take up 3 characters. In other words, if there's only 1 character or 2 characters or 2 digits, these are actually numeric numbers, I want it to still display with 3, but with a leading 0 or zeros. So once again, I will click Product ID, hold Control and Shift, and this time I'm using my down arrow. Now I can't truly visibly see if that actually went to the last row of the data, so I'll press my down arrow again, and I see that in fact I have gone all the way to the last row of the worksheet, 1,048,576. So still holding my Control Shift, or if you let go of them, just hold them again and press the up arrow, and then you'll see you're at the bottom of your data. And in this case, I actually didn't want the product ID label. So the first thing I'm going to do is select that and press my down arrow once so that I'm starting with the first value in the column. Now I'll do my Control Shift. I know I only need to do 1 arrow to get down to row 82, which is the end of my data. And then we'll go up to the number format group in the Home tab of the ribbon. We'll go to General, and the drop down will give us the common choices or some of the most frequently used choices. A little iffy on taste and opinion there, but we're just going to go all the way down to more number formats. I like to do it from the list here because then I can see some previews of what already exists. I'll do more number formats. We get the dialog box, And then I'm going to take a look at custom. So we see here there are several different custom formats for numbers. And if I choose, let's say 0.00, then I see that our sample, which would be the primarily selected cell, is showing 7.00. Well, that's not what I'm going to want. We see some of these others with number signs and what they do to our sample. What we actually want to do is we want to see a number whether there's a number there or not. So we're going to wipe out this whole section, this whole little window that says type, and we're going to type in 3 zeros. And we see that that makes our first item 007, and we'll click OK and see how that does for the rest of them. So now we have those numbers formatted the way we want. I'm also going to center them. And it doesn't matter how someone enters them. If we go up to product ID, down arrow, and I enter 152, it would be fine. I'll Control Z to undo that. And I very often test things and get used to that Control Z because that's how you undo your test. And if I do 53, it's 053. So I don't have to change how I enter them. Yet if I do enter them with all 3 digits, it will also be the same. So that takes care of our product ID. I could also, in this case, narrow that column. Maybe I need the space for printing purposes, let's say. But we'll just leave that expanded for now. The next thing I want to do is I want to format this unit price column. So once again, I will click on the column label, press my down arrow key, Control Shift down, eyeballing that I should have been down to row 82, which I in fact am. And we'll go back up to the number group in our home tab of the ribbon, and there are some shortcut buttons here. So there's a counting number format, and that's the one I want to use here. So a counting number format lines up your decimal places, leaves some extra space on each side of the cell for those parentheses for negative numbers, and lines up your currency symbols, whatever that may be. If I wanted a different currency symbol, I can certainly do that. And there we go. But we'll undo that. The next 3 columns, again, are similar values. They're all referring to quantities of product. So I will select units in stock, down arrow once, hold Shift while I go 2 columns to the right, and now I'll do Control Shift down arrow. For these values, I want not the next shortcut button, percent style. I want this to be comma style. Now, comma style looks and seems like it's going to be the number style, but in fact, it is the accounting style, but just with no currency symbol. Now, these are quantities. We don't sell partial items, so we're going to reduce the decimal or decrease the decimal places with these buttons that are also in the number group. And half the time I can't remember which one is which. I click one. If it's wrong, I click the other one. Notice the 0 values are represented by hyphens. So that's also part of the accounting style. And those are our numbers. Now here's the other thing. We get this list, and this list will grow, right? This is a list of products. As we get new products, more will be added at the bottom. So if I want to, let's say, have a total inventory number, maybe up here above units in stock, and I will put total, and this cell is actually still using the white font, so I will simply format it the way I want to, which is I will go up to our styles and I'll use heading 4, and I will right align it so that it lines up with my data, and then I can also increase the indent to push it in from the right hand margin of the cell. Now here's the thing, if I need a total, why do I want to keep scrolling down to the bottom, having to insert blank rows above my total when I can simply see the total at the top? So if I just simply want to add these up, I will use my auto sum button, which again you can find for your convenience on the home tab in the editing group. There's auto sum. which shortcuts the equals, the sum, open and close parentheses, but because there's no numbers to the left or above this cell, it doesn't know what to add up for me. So once again, I will click on units in stock, press my down arrow, and then hold Control and Shift and press my down arrow again, and that gets me the reference down to row 82. But I also want to make sure I'm accounting for any new rows that may come into play later. So I will do Control Shift down arrow again, and now it's going all the way to the bottom of the sheet. So I can do Control Enter, and there's my total. And because we totaled cells that were formatted with that custom format, which is essentially currency with no symbol, it automatically formatted this cell the same way. So I think that is everything I need to do here before I move on to the next topic of this data. Now, Control Home is how you always get to the beginning of the sheet. And you will notice I'm not saying Control Home gets you to the A1 cell. When you have panes frozen and you do Control Home, it gets you to the quote first cell of the worksheet. So it took me back to C6. And of course I do need to save, so we'll do that. And the next thing I want to point out is that this particular set of data, now that I have it formatted, it's easy to read, and it can be sorted and filtered in any way that is needed. Again, I'll leave that for Helen to demonstrate for you. What I do want to talk about is how this is one big list, and then there's this column called discontinued. Now, what I see a lot of is people will start off, and it could be because they started keeping track of something organically and then it grew, or they're just thinking they need to separate things. They need to organize things into different sheets. And then comes a day that they decide they need to look at all the data. And there are certainly ways to combine multiple sheets of data, but here's where that gets tricky. I have another set of data here for orders. So I have a sheet here called Buchanan because it's orders by Buchanan, Stephen. And it's order ID, customer ID, required dates, and shipping and freight cost. And then we have the next sheet for Nancy DeVolio. Now the most obvious thing is already we're seeing some differentiation happening between the sheets just in the title. So orders by Buchanan, Stephen, and now on Nancy's sheet, it's orders by Nancy DeVolio. And then we go to Fuller's sheet, another difference in title, and it also looks very different. And if we flip back and forth, we can see, oh, this one's now got a commission column added. So even if you start with the same master layout, odds are that over time they will start to stray from being the exact same setup. On King, we have this one has ship country. If we go back and look at DeVolio, we actually notice that this one's got order date in the second column and formatted differently. So what I tell people is instead of trying to organize by which sheet things are on, try keeping all of your data in the same sheet, and then whatever classification method you were using for putting it on different sheets, just make that into a column. So now we have an employee column, and at any point in time, if I want to see all of Buchanan's orders, I can filter, uncheck select all, Stephen Buchanan, there we go. And then we can keep track of commission for everybody. We can format the order date however everyone agrees it needs to be formatted. We could add ship country. And now we're collecting all the same data for all the orders, and at any time we can see it filtered not only by employee, but by ship country or any of the other fields, and sorted however we want to see it. So if you start off with it all on one sheet, it will make your life a whole lot easier, especially down the road. So back to our bigger data, that's why we have this discontinued column, which at any point in time, if we were to turn on filtering, we could see all the undiscontinued products, anything that has false in the discontinued column is still an active product. Folks, that wraps up my time with you today. I do want to remind you that it's still possible to get the All Access Pass, which gets you a ton of stuff for only $99 at this point. That offer will expire soon, so get in on it as soon as you can. Session recordings, 10 ebooks, all kinds of things. So get on that, and thank you for joining me, and I'll see you in the chat. This is Sharon Fry signing off.